where he was a radio operator and instructor for mobile campus to Sanford, Florida, where George Zimmerman had murdered Trayvon Martin.
This country is never going to voluntarily let go of slavery. It's too profitable. And Garnett knew this because he traveled not just throughout the United States, but he spent time looking at slavery in Latin America. And he was a young, what they used to call back then a cabin boy. He apprenticed on a small ship, small sailing ship, and was actually spent time in Cuba. And he saw how slavery worked there. And he told Douglass and the older generation of abolitionists, with all due respect, love what you're saying about, you know, organizing and everything like that, but until we can organize an armed insurrection of the slaves, we'll never end slavery in this country. There's a tendency when historians talk about lynching today, or they talk about anti-black or anti-brown violence, they'll use the term mob, and there's a lot of anti-black pogroms or so-called riots in the history of the U.S. So you have like Red Summer in Chicago in 1919, in Florida, the Rosewood Massacre, the Ocoee Election Day Massacre. And it was very traditional for people to use the term mob or riot to talk about these events, but now we're waking up because anytime you have a group of essentially armed white men who carry out an attack on a community and it lasts more than 1 hour, you have to resupply those people. See, it's only in Hollywood that you have an infinite supply of ammunition. So, but you also have to know where to hit the community. Who are the leaders of that community? So now you're talking about intelligence. And then you're talking, you know, once you reach the end of the first day, where do these guys get their more ammunition from? Where do they get their transportation from? See, and because I have a military background, I'm a third-generation military veteran, that's how I analyze these so-called mobs. And the other thing about the so-called mob is very oftentimes you'll find military veterans in that so-called mob. Or you'll find the sheriff, a deputy sheriff or the chief of police. So it's much more intentional. The idea behind calling it a mob is to hope that you can convince people these were just a bunch of, you know, outrageous, maybe drunk or wild people. But no, they had very clear plans, because at the end of a lot of these massacres, white elites end up taking this land from black people. And I mentioned the Elaine Massacre, for example, in the Arkansas Delta. That was rich bottom land. It was very productive. And so white people kill a lot of black farmers, and then they take their land from them. But it happened right down the road in Ocoee in western Orange County, the same thing. At the end of that massacre, black people have to flee, or they have to sell their land for a very small amount to big white landowners. It was intentional. Now, getting back to Suriname, it's a wonderful example because these are referring to maroon people, Africans who have been enslaved by the Dutch, who essentially fight a century-long liberation war. And other European powers know about this war. The Dutch, of course, are trying to keep the lid on it, right, because it's fairly successful. And that's the thing that really leads to abolition in the Netherlands proper. But it's also what leads to emancipation in other parts of Europe as well, because the Europeans realize at a certain point they've lost the military capacity to keep control of these populations. And so they move to another kind of colonialism, right? So it's not as if they wake up and start to become more conscious. I mean, I'll give you one final example. The British actually gave money to help fund the French anti-slavery organization in Paris. The reason the British did this is not because they felt bad for slaves in France, or that they felt bad for slaves in the French Empire, but because they wanted to move in the French sugar interests, right? And so this is something C.L.R. James and Eric Williams taught back in the 1930s, that colonial powers don't do things for moral reasons, right? And the French got an even larger indemnity from Haitians who ended slavery through revolting. And what it reminds us of is that slavery creates the greatest fortunes that the world has ever seen up to that point. in sugar, as you point out, in nutmeg and cotton and other crops and industries. And people are not going to let that go easily. And in fact, even in the United States, there's compensation for slave owners in Washington, D.C. A lot of people don't know this. And there would have been compensation for the southern plantation owners if they had not revolted. That was a plan, right? And so they lose out, in a sense, by taking up arms against the U.S. But see, but you mentioned apprenticeship also, and this is what all the European powers, that's why we have to remember slavery is a labor system to extract profit, right? And so the British had the apprenticeship system too, the French tried it. The British system ends because people revolt against it, right? And so, but think about apprenticeships. The amazing thing about this is these people are already worked in these industries for generations. How could they be apprentices? It's kind of a bad use of the term even back then.